The United States says it destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels in the Persian Gulf. But here's the question almost no headline is asking. If even the US president admits there were no confirmed mines in the Strait of Hormuz, what exactly triggered this escalation? Because once you examine the timeline closely, the justification begins to look less like a response to an immediate threat and more like a strike based on what Iran might do, not what it had already done. That distinction matters because acting on capability rather than action dramatically lowers the threshold for war. When governments justify military strikes based on potential threats instead of confirmed ones, escalation becomes easier, faster, and far harder to control. And that appears to be exactly what is unfolding now in the Persian Gulf. According to the Pentagon, US forces have already struck more than 5,000 targets since the war began. Defense officials say the next phase will be even more intense, with more bombers, more fighters, and a larger volume of strikes than at any earlier stage. In other words, the trajectory of the war is not stabilization, it is acceleration. At the same time, Washington announced it destroyed 16 Iranian vessels capable of laying naval mines. Yet the president publicly acknowledged there were no confirmed reports that mines had actually been placed in the Strait of Hormuz. That means the strike targeted the possibility of a threat, rather than an active attack. Preventive warfare of that kind raises difficult questions about where the new line for military action is being drawn. And the stakes are enormous, because the Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow corridor between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean. When military conflict reaches that choke point, it stops being a regional issue and starts becoming a global economic one. Iran has responded by threatening to shut down oil exports from the region entirely. Officials in Tehran say they will not allow even a single liter of oil to reach what they call hostile countries. Whether that threat is fully implemented or used as leverage, the signal to the global energy system is unmistakable. The conflict is now directly targeting oil supply routes. The reaction from industry shows how serious that risk is. Oil companies have already begun rerouting tankers away from the Strait of Hormuz to avoid the possibility of attack. Saudi Arabia's state oil company says it is pushing alternative pipelines to full capacity in order to move crude around the strait. When energy companies start reorganizing global shipping routes, it means they are preparing for a prolonged disruption. Meanwhile, the war itself is widening geographically. Residents in Tehran report some of the heaviest bombing since the conflict began, with residential buildings struck and large numbers of civilians fleeing the capital for rural areas. Across the region, missile and drone attacks are now crossing borders into multiple countries. Lebanon has already seen deadly airstrikes that killed civilians, soldiers, and medical responders attempting to rescue the wounded. Air defense systems in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain are now intercepting incoming missiles and drones connected to the conflict. Each interception is another sign that the war is spreading across the region rather than remaining contained. Here's the part that rarely gets reported clearly. Public messaging often frames these actions as limited, targeted military operations designed to neutralize specific threats. But when you step back and look at the documented facts, thousands of strikes, attacks spreading across several countries, global oil routes disrupted, the scale looks much closer to a regional war already unfolding. Political rhetoric is escalating just as quickly as the military activity. Iranian leaders say they will not negotiate while their country is under attack, while some officials have issued direct threats toward American leadership. At the same time, the US president has publicly suggested the possibility of influencing who might lead Iran after the war. That kind of language moves a conflict beyond deterrence and towards something much larger, the question of regime change. And historically, wars framed around political control of another country rarely remain short or limited. Even inside Washington, lawmakers say they still do not fully understand the long-term strategy. After a classified briefing, one senator admitted publicly that she was unsure what the administration's endgame actually is. When wars begin without a clearly defined endpoint, history shows they tend to expand rather than resolve. And that brings us back to the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway carrying 1/5 of the world's oil, while surrounded by competing militaries and rising geopolitical tension. When energy arteries become military battlegrounds, the consequences rarely remain local. The real issue is no longer just whether this conflict escalates. The deeper issue is whether the system of global power that produced it is already pushing events in that direction. Because when military strategy, energy supply, and political prestige collide in the same crisis, the costs almost never stay on the battlefield. They ripple outward into the entire world.